The Lonnie Zamora case is the quintessential close encounters of the third kind. I'm willing to bet that J. Allen Hynek created the statement or the definition of a close encounters of the third kind, quite possibly because of the Lonnie Zamora case. But it is the textbook definition of a close encounters of the third kind.
On April 24, 1964, Socorro Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora investigated a UFO south of Socorro. He approached the object about 50 feet away. Zamora saw landing gear, a red insignia, and two humanoids. Outside the craft, the egg-shaped object then lifted off, leaving burned bushes and landing gear impressions. The object and its extraordinary occupants remain unknown.
That is the textbook definition of what exactly the Lonnie Zamora case is. And without getting into too much detail, which you could easily listen to on a previous podcast I did a few years ago about the Lonnie Zamora case, where I really get into the deep, dark details of the case. Just search for the Zamora case in the Too Boldly Pod archives and you can listen to it there. So I won't rehash everything for those of you that have heard that episode, but it is without a doubt the quintessential close encounters of the third kind case. It covers one thing that I talk about a lot on this podcast, and you hear debunkers say all the time about qualified observers. Well, Lonnie Zamora was the prototypical qualified observers that the debunkers want. He was a trained police officer, an experienced police officer, a decorated police officer that was well respected within his community. Everybody seemed to like him, and not only as a police officer, but as a fellow citizen and a human being. Everybody liked Lonnie Zamora. People didn't think in any way, shape, or form that he was the type of person that would do anything or create something just to get sort of attention. So, as far as a qualified observer goes, you don't get much better than Lonnie Zamora could possibly be.
Well, going up to halfway, I could see a white object to my left there. I thought it was a turnover car. When I got up on top of the mesa there, I looked down and I seen this big white object on the ground. I thought I could see something around the craft there. I could see some figures looked like they were walking around the craft. I saw this flame come on from underneath it, and I ran back behind my car, and it went up to 20, 30 feet up in the air.
Dios mío.
At first, after I got to my senses, I said, did I see it or didn't I, Or what happened, And that's it.
And that's kind of edited to his entire story. There's a lot of other interviews that he has done about the story, but that's essentially it. He rolled up on this thing. He saw these beings, which he called little people, not big enough to be an adult, but like children, and they didn't notice him. at first, and then when they did, they didn't panic. They just turned and got in their craft, and as you heard him say, it rose up into the ground. It sort of hovered there over him for a minute, and then it shot off into the horizon. And as sort of normal with UFO sightings, he tried to contact his police office and report what was going on, but he couldn't make any contact with them until the thing had shot off into the horizon. When he did contact a friend of his, which was a New Mexico state trooper, to come and help him with what had just happened.
Lonnie Zamora, he's a very dependable, honest type of person. He's not one to create or make stories or build things up to make it exciting or anything.
That is something that is very important to know, because not only is his friend here the first person on the scene outside of Lonnie Zamora saying that, but everybody within the town, all his coworkers at the police force, everybody that knew Lonnie Zamora said he was a stand up individual, not somebody that would create something for attention.
Like that. He's a very well-liked type of a person. We found some indentation on the ground where this thing had landed, and the marks into the ground were 9 inches deep, 8 inches long, and 9 inches wide.
That is your basic explanation of a close encounters of the second kind, where they leave markings or some kind of evidence where a UFO or an object had landed. But this case was a close encounters of the third kind, as you're going to hear him talk about here in a little while.
I started looking for tracks, human tracks, but the only thing I found was impressions on the ground. They were made by a perfect circle.
That is an interesting statement that he had made, and Lonnie Zamora has said that in subsequent interviews or previous interviews that he has done, that there weren't any footprints that they could find, only these little circles. And he did admit that he was sort of taken in by what was going on, so his police training didn't completely kick in where he was observing everything to remember it later. But what he did observe, and you heard him state, is these beings were very small, like children, but he didn't notice whether they had actual human type feet or not. So it was kind of strange not to find any footprints, but they only found these little sort of circular items where these beings were standing.
But I found no human tracks, no shoe prints.
This gentleman is the commander of the military when they first arrived in the scene. And as you might exactly expect, that once they got there and started to investigate, it's a small town, so word traveled fast, and some bystanders had showed up just to see what was going on. So the military immediately made all of the gawkers leave the scene, and they sort of cordoned off the area, and things took a sort of prototypical military investigation turn. But I like what this person says about Lonnie Zamora 30 years after the fact. If he was a true military man, towing the military hiding everything line, you'd think he would just sort of bury Lonnie Zamora. But
My first impression was that it was something from the range that needed possible help, first aid, attention, or at best security. The more I got into it, the less convinced I was that that was the case.
and then he went on to say that he thought or he believed that Lonnie Zamora actually saw something that he couldn't explain. And it was clear from his interview with him that he was emotionally affected by what he had witnessed. He went on to say that he wasn't going to say that it was an alien spacecraft, but he would say that it was something that Lonnie Zamora hadn't experienced before, and essentially said, he didn't come out and say it, but he sort of inferred that it wasn't any sort of secret governmental project that a lot of the debunkers and whatnot had claimed, since it happened even up to this day that it was. And there's a lot of people that will say that it was nothing more than the government's early prototypes of the lunar landers, which they were working on in 1964, but it wasn't leaving the laboratory yet. And then other people would say it was just a bunch of college students pulling a prank. But you heard this military officer, this commander, say he didn't think it was any of that. He believed that Lonnie had saw something that he couldn't quite explain. So, what exactly was it? I guess we really don't know. We have to take Lonnie's word for it. But as far as close encounters of the third kind, that there is the quintessential example. But there are other ones that are even more mysterious than that one, like the one from Virginia, Brazil in the mid 1990s.